All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this MUGUT or UTSPUG, however you want to say that. It's the Utah SharePoint User Group or the Microsoft User Group Utah, the MUGUT out on Meetup, our virtual user group webinar. It's a lot of names in there, John. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, and I'm nowhere near Utah, so I hope I'll be excused for that.
And for those that don't know John, quick introduction. So John is a dual MVP in Office Apps and Services and also business applications or the data platform.
Data platform, yeah.
A data platform. And so he is a SharePoint guy who has also been in the Power BI and analytics space for a long time. He's a CTO of UnlimitedViz, who are the makers of tyGraph. And I'll just hand it over to you, John, and let you go from there. And I'll kind of, let me just, I guess, other questions that people will inevitably ask. Is it being recorded? Yes, it is. The recording, I'll post this up and make it available out on YouTube probably this evening, push it out to everybody. But then, any other questions that are asked, use the question and answer module here in Zoom. And I'll try to field those questions and interrupt John throughout.
Perfect. There'll be a couple of chances where I'm hoping for there to be questions because there'll be a couple of data refreshes that might take a few seconds. So that would be ideal.
Excellent. Oh, and yes, you've got this picture up. John is also the Jack Cousteau of the SharePoint community. So yes.
Yeah, that's what I like to do when I'm not doing this stuff. It also explains my rather weird Twitter handle. But my name is John White, so you got to be creative at some level. That one's taken. And
there is a number 1 that's hidden behind that stat on your shirt. It's not 00% Canadian. It's 100.
That's a good point, actually. I've never noticed that.
Right, well, over to you, John.
Yeah, all right, thanks. And yeah, like you mentioned, before I jump forward, also, in addition to all of that stuff, Jason Himmelstein and I run a podcast. We actually just recorded the latest one this morning. It's a weekly podcast on business intelligence news in the Microsoft space. So if you want to stay up to date on things, etc., feel free to subscribe to it. It's the Bifocal podcast. You can get it at all good podcast aggregators everywhere. And if you want, if you're at all interested in getting the deck here, you could just take a shot of that barcode in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, or just use that URL, link.tygraph.com/bifocal session. You'll get presented with a Microsoft forum with a bunch of questions on it. They serve to run through a demo. You can ask for more information on our product, tyGraph, which does analytics for Office 365 if you like. Otherwise, the only reason we're going to ask for your email is to send you a link to this deck. So it's a link to the same OneDrive I'm using here. So if I make any changes on the fly, you'll get those changes. Anyway, so that's along the bottom. It's along the bottom of most of the slides, not all of them. So we're going to get into the relationship in this talk between Power BI and SharePoint. And SharePoint is kind of a multifaceted beast in that area. We're going to first of all talk about some of the basics. Then we'll dive into using SharePoint as a container, using SharePoint as a data source, and then finally using SharePoint as a report canvas, which has kind of traditionally been its role in the BI space. And then we'll just wrap it up. And as Christian mentioned, I'd love to take questions along the way. If you could just throw them in the Q&A window. He'll interrupt me when there's anything particularly relevant. As a webcast, it's a little difficult. You can't just throw your hand up, but I don't like people to get lost or get behind as we go. So please feel free to interrupt. All right, let's start out with some of the basics here. And answer a fairly basic question. What is Power BI? If you're brand new to this and you don't know what Power BI is, it's basically a way to easily get answers from your data. It's self-service reporting and analytics. In a lot of ways, it's a lot like Excel without worksheets. That might make a little more sense here in just a minute. But Power BI itself, and certainly you'll come to realize this if you're designing reports in Power BI, it's composed of a few things. At its heart is really the modeling engine, and the modeling engine, or the data models or data sets, as you might hear them referred to in Power BI, is what we came to know as Power Pivot in Excel back a bunch of years ago. In fact, it still is there in Excel. It is referred to still in some places as Power Pivot, but more likely it's referred to as the data model. And that's where you want to put your data if you're importing it from outside sources, or if you're accessing outside source data in Excel. You don't want to just load data into worksheets. It's not the most efficient way to do things. So that's a core piece of this, and that's essentially it's analysis services that's running in Excel or in Power BI. That's the engine that's in behind everything. So we run all of our reports against that data model. We get data into that data model by using an ETL engine, ETL standing, of course, for extract, transform, and load. And product-wise, that's known as Power Query in the Microsoft space. So Power Query is the tool that we use to get data from where it sits into our data model, and then we basically form it from an analytical standpoint using the tools available to that model. They use two different languages. Power Query uses a language in behind the scenes called M, and Power Pivot, or the data model, uses a language called DAX, and they're different things for different purposes, but it's important to understand that there's two of those things. And then finally, there is a report platform, and that's the visual side of Power BI, and that's where you put your visuals, where you do your clicky, draggy, droppy sort of a data analysis. And then you have a report canvas, you drag visuals onto it, you connect that to data, and that's the way it works. And you can access that as a viewer, essentially, or as a consumer of reports. You do it through a browser, through the Power BI app service, app.powerbi.com. And to design reports, you use Power BI Designer. Actually, it's not called Power BI Designer, is it? It should be. It's called Power BI Desktop. And that leads to a fair bit of confusion out there, because Power BI Desktop, a lot of people think is the desktop version of the Power BI service, and it is not. It is the design tool. It is what you use to build reports for the Power BI service. So that'll come a little clear here in just a little while, I hope. All right. So what is SharePoint? I probably don't have to belabor the point to this audience. I give this talk to SQL audiences sometimes, so I spend a little more time on the SharePoint slides. But with respect to Power BI, it is essentially three things. It can be a container for files, right? It's a file system in the cloud. It's a document management system. It's where the Excel files sit. It can also serve as a source for data in the form of lists. There's a lot of data sitting around in SharePoint lists. Rightly or wrongly, there's data sitting around in SharePoint lists. And the traditional role of SharePoint, if you go way back, say SharePoint 2007, if you remember the marketing wheel for SharePoint 2007, the big pie, there were 6 pieces of the pie. And one of those pieces was business intelligence. And really the role of SharePoint, as far as that piece of pie was concerned, was as a reporting surface. It was a place that we could bring together through web parts, typically on a page, various aspects of BI. And what the Office team at the time considered a report was Excel and visuals within Excel. But you could bring things together from reporting services, ultimately Performance Point, God forbid. But you could do all of those things. And SharePoint was kind of the center of the BI universe back then. It's not so much anymore. SharePoint now sits alongside of Power BI. And that's all to the good, quite frankly. So that's the basics kind of out of the way. So let's talk a little bit about using SharePoint as a container specifically. Now, if I want to use Power BI and I want to use the service, the browser experience, I can just go and get data right out of the browser. And the options I have, there's a number of database options, etc. But when I want to connect to a file, I have some SharePoint options available to me. I can connect, obviously I can connect to a local file, and that can just be a file on my file system on a local machine. That's not a good idea to do. It's best to load your data out of SharePoint because it becomes quickly refreshable. And you've got a couple of options. So you can see here in the little image, we've got OneDrive Business, OneDrive Personal, and SharePoint Team Sites. And this is the experience from a personal workspace. If you go at this from a Power BI workspace that's connected to a SharePoint team site, you'll see a OneDrive icon for the team site, and that doesn't really make any sense. But what it is the documents library for that team site, and then you very easily have access to to your personal OneDrive as well. So you can connect all of these things, and you can arbitrarily put in any SharePoint team sites as well. When you connect to data in this way, again, using the Power BI service, you can connect to two types of files, CSV and Excel. And what you're going to do is import data, for the most part, into a new Power BI data model. It's going to use the format of the data as it sits within that file, and you'll be able to build straight up reports off it. And that's all you're going to be able to do using the service. You won't be able to do Power Query, and you won't be able to do any data modeling. So your data should be in good shape if you want to use this option. You will be able to automatically refresh hourly if you pull data in through the service from a SharePoint or a OneDrive site. In fact, that's the only way you're going to be able to refresh it. You can turn that on or off, but it's simply going to be an hour refresh. And as I mentioned, you can connect to any SharePoint online library with it. Now, what I just described is completely true for CSV files. It's also true for Excel files if you're going to be importing data from the worksheets in Excel. So if you happen to have data sitting in a worksheet in Excel, that's what you're going to do. But if you've built up Excel as a BI tool itself, if you've used Excel already to connect to data and maybe build up a data model with some Power Query and use visuals within Excel, you can still continue to do so. So when you choose Excel as a file type option and you're connecting to data in SharePoint, you're going to get these two options that you see. You can either import the Excel data from that file into Power BI, and that's what I was talking about before. You'll pull data out of the worksheet into a brand new Power BI data model, or you can connect to that Excel file as it sits. And that's much the way SharePoint works with Excel today. If you open up an Excel file in SharePoint in the web experience, it's going to open in Excel online, and you're going to be able to interact with it. Power BI can do exactly the same thing, but it can do some fairly interesting things further than that. We'll get there here in just a second. So to understand exactly, what behavior you're going to see, it's important to understand what an Excel file is composed of. If you rename a file, an Excel file, from XLSX to .rar, .zip, you'll be able to open it up in a file compression editor like WinRAR or WinZip or whatever you happen to use. And you're going to see this representation over here on the right. You can see it's basically got its own little file system inside that contains all of the data for that Excel file. And what does it contain? Well, as I mentioned before, it's going to contain, or it may contain, worksheet data. And that's data in columns and rows, big rectangles of data in your worksheet. You may also have visuals. Now, visuals are attached to worksheets in the Excel world. And that's one way to visualize data. You can visualize data that's in worksheets, and you can visualize data that's in a data model. So that data model is also something you're going to find in there if it's been built. So when you import data, when you connect to data in Excel, one of the options you'll have is add this data to the model. I suggest you always do that and don't load it into the worksheets. Unfortunately, the default behavior is to load into the worksheet. But when you store the data in the model, it's stored in a read-only fashion, and it's highly compressed. So you can get millions and millions of rows of data into an Excel file that way, but just not in the worksheet. The file also contains both classic connections and Power Query connections. Classic are those ODC files that you use to connect to that wind up littering your desktop, etc. And Power Query is the default experience now in Excel as well as in Power BI. And they're completely compatible. You can copy and paste the code from Power Query from one into the other with pretty much 100% fidelity. Also, if you have used Excel in the past, you may have used a tool called Power View. It hasn't officially been deprecated, I don't believe, but it's gone away. Everybody says don't use it, and they're hiding it from the ribbon. But you may still find Power View sheets in an Excel file. They actually will work to it, or you can import them into Power BI. And you can also have things called 3D maps in a worksheet. So you can have all of these different things, and some of them will come into the service. Mostly it's going to be worksheet data we'll be working with, and we're going to be concerned with data models. All right, so let's jump ahead a little bit. Let's get into these various scenarios. Depending on what we're doing from a SharePoint and Power BI standpoint, you're going to, again, get these different behaviors. So in this scenario, we're going to walk through that what I was talking about just before. I'm going to use the Power BI service to import data from an Excel file. Okay, so I'm going to pull the data from the worksheet. So in this case, the user connects into Power BI. It says, I want to connect to an Excel file in SharePoint. That when you do that and you choose the data import option, data from those worksheets gets brought down now into a new data model that's sitting within Power BI. And that's all to the good. This is true no matter if the file is sitting in SharePoint or even on your file system. Now, what happens when it's time to refresh that data? The file has changed. I now want the data in my data model to be updated to reflect that change. On a scheduled basis, in this case, every single hour, SharePoint Online is simply going to update the data in that model. However, if you did pick file system, if you didn't pick SharePoint, it's still updatable. But the problem is now you're going to have to go through an on-premises data gateway. So you're going to have one of those installed, and you're going to have that location in the file system registered with that gateway. It is still possible, but it is, there are more moving parts. There's more stuff you have to worry about doing. Okay. So let's take that second scenario I was talking about. I now have an Excel file that I have got a data model embedded in, and that's represented by that little cube you see there against the Excel file icon. Same sort of scenario, except now file system is not even an option for me. I can't do this using the file system. So in this case, the user connects to Power BI, says, I want to connect to that Excel file. Well, Power BI actually just hands this off to Excel Online. You'll see that if you do this in the service, it's got Excel Online right at the top of the screen. Excel Online reaches back into SharePoint and says, okay, you've got a data model attached. I'm going to take that data model and I'm going to jam that into basically Azure Analysis Services in behind the scenes. You never see any of this, but that's what's going on. So once that happens, Excel Online enables the interaction with that data model, and so the user can do that as well. Now, that original Excel file was pulled from one particular data source. The connection to that data source is brought across so that when it comes time to update, Power BI can now go off, fire off a schedule and go to that data source directly and update the data model right within SharePoint. And then upon the next use, by the way, that data model gets brought over to Azure Analysis Services again. And this is an important point. It's the file in SharePoint that is getting updated. So when you connect Power BI to an Excel file sitting in SharePoint and it's got an embedded data model, you can have it automatically get refreshed for all users, not just Power BI users. And that's something that's not very well known. All right. Those were both examples of connecting in with the service. If I want to build a proper report, if I want to get working with Power Query to do transformations of my data on the way into the model, or I want to make model edits, I want to make calculated measures and calculated columns, I need to build a report using Power BI Desktop. Now, Power BI Desktop allows you to create reports from CSV, XLSX files, not just XLSX, and many, many other data sources, 100 and some odd data sources at my last count. It lets you do the full-fledged modeling and reporting. This is your tool for doing the whole shoot and match. When you're done, the report gets published to the service. So from Power BI Desktop, you publish it to the service, and then other users can use it. Unlike connecting to the file in a service, you're going to have to set up the schedule for automatic refresh. It's not turned on by default like it is with OneDrive and SharePoint and connecting in the service. Again, any local files are going to require, or any on-premises files are going to require a data gateway to get access. And the one thing I want you to take away from today is if you're connecting to an Excel file, you're building a report from an Excel file. And your file, well, first of all, your file should be stored in SharePoint. And if your file is stored in SharePoint, you should use the SharePoint folder source to connect to it, not the Excel source. And that's fairly counterintuitive, I'm aware. But here's why. When I use Power BI Desktop to build a report from an Excel file, from data that's stored in Excel, and I pick the Excel connector, I can now build up my data model. I can do my transformations, my calculated measures, my calculated columns, etc. When I'm done building that report, I can then publish that out to the Power BI service, and where users can consume the report and work with the data model, etc. It's at refresh time that we wind up having a problem. If we need to refresh from that Excel file as a source again, the Excel connector thinks everything is a local file. So when the schedule fires off, you need to go through a gateway to be able to go and get that file, no matter where it sits. It's basically a file system. So instead, if we were to use the SharePoint folder, same scenario, we connect to it using the SharePoint folder connector, publish the report to Power BI. Power BI can then go straight back to SharePoint Online to make its connection and do its refreshes. I hope that's fairly, I'm going to walk through some demos at this point. And this would be a great time to jump in with any questions if there are any, Christian.
Nothing posted yet, but yeah.
It's so quiet. They're either getting everything I'm saying or I'm completely, what?
That's why I need the cricket sound effect here. So you ask questions and I just hit that button. Yeah.
All right.
I'll add that in.
Yeah, that's a great idea. All right, well, let's start out. I've got a few things. I'm going to start out with a thermostat file I've got in here. Where is it? It's this guy here. I've got basically I've got an Ecobee thermostat, and I get reports every month, and I want to build a report of some of my thermostat use. How much did my furnace run? So if I'm gonna come over here, and I'm just in the wrong spot. So if I'm gonna come down here, so I'm in a workspace called Demos. Doesn't really matter for our purposes right now, but I'm in Power BI already. I'm going to come down here to the bottom left and hit Get Data. So if you first come into Power BI, you've got nothing in there, you're going to be presented with this screen right off the bat. And I can go and get data from a number of different sources. Well, I'm going to come down here into Files. And now you see that basically a version of the image I showed you before from the slide deck. And right here, I'm in a workspace. So I get a slightly different set of options. But one of my options here is OneDrive-Demos. So the Power BI team, in its infinite wisdom, has decided to call SharePoint document libraries OneDrives. It's not confusing at all, right? We all know that Microsoft's not the greatest at naming things. So I could go at this site by coming in through the SharePoint team site and giving it the URL of the team site and drilling down and getting it that way. But this does give me a measure of convenience, as it's going to point directly at the documents library for my demos team site. So I'm going to click on that because in the Power BI world, at least in the V1 workspaces world, a Power BI workspace equals a group, an Office 365 group, which of course equals a SharePoint team site. So this is the root of that document library. And I'm going to come down here into my demos area, deep dive on SharePoint and Power BI. And I'm going to select this here report. This is an XLSX file, and it's got the data I want to report on. And I'm going to click on Connect. Now you see that other screen that you saw. And in this case, I'm just going to import the Excel data into Power BI. So I'm going to click on Import. And we can't find any data formatted as a table. That's great. I did it this morning, you know that? I'm not sure why that happened. I have another way to do this, so bear with me.
Sure you did, John. Yeah. So unprofessional. Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty bad, isn't it? I'm going to come in here one more time, and I don't know why that happened. That is the file I need to use. I'm going to come and use this file. I may have jumped the gun on that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Connect, and I'm going to import. And that's going to work a lot better. So, okay, I chose the wrong file, so I'll put my heart back. Thank you. So you can see it says it's importing data, and it's literally reaching out to that file and pulling data into a new data model, or a data set is how it's referred to in the UI here. So I'm going to go ahead and view my data set. And now I'm taken to the report editing screen. And this is the exact same screen that you would see in Power BI Desktop. And you can see I've got a table on the right-hand side. And most reports have multiple tables, but I'm only going to get one because I've done this straight import from a single file. And you can see I've got a number of dimensions and measures down the right-hand side. And I want to show off a couple of things. So I'm going to show off the cooling stage 1, cooling stage 2, heating stage 1, and heating stage 2. And so for that period of time, that is how much my furnace ran. And I want to add a time component into it. So I'm just going to throw the date in here. And I'm going to stretch this out. And so this is how much my furnace ran a year ago, frankly. This is September 2018 is the file I pulled in here. And you can see I'm just outside of Toronto, so you can see it was still warm at the beginning of September. The second week it got cooler, so the heating came on and the cooling came on again. That was a lovely, third week, and then finally it got cold again. No surprise there. And if you want to see exactly what happened with the temperature, I can throw on, I'm going to change the visual. So it, by the way, it shows a column chart as my visual. I want to use a stacked column chart, and I want to add a line chart to it. So I'm going to come down here to this combo chart, and I'm going to make it the stacked column chart. So now you can see that the colors are stacked on top of each other. And I'm going to come down here and pick outdoor temperature, and I'm going to just drag him down to the line values over here. Now you can see here's a line for my temperature. But there's something amiss. You'll see the scale here is in thousands. So my furnace runtime is in seconds. So you can imagine, that's going to be in thousands each day of how often the furnace ran. But my temperature probably shouldn't be in thousands, especially because we work in Celsius here in Canada. What's going on? The service says, okay, these are numbers. I know what to do with numbers. I need to add them up. But with temperature, when I'm aggregating down to the day level, because I'm taking measurements every 5 minutes, I don't want to add those numbers up. I want to average them, but it doesn't do that automatically. And I can't go and change my data model. I don't have any data modeling capability to go and tell it to always use averages. So but I can do that in the visual. So if I come over here to outdoor temperature and I drop down, I can pick average. And you're going to see suddenly there's the line changes. It's more pronounced. And you can see along the right-hand side, we get temperature in Celsius. So here was the high temperature at the beginning. And the high bars are basically the reddish bars. They used to be red. The palette just changed this month. The blue ones are the cool ones. And that happens when the temperature's higher, obviously, and the heating comes on when it's cooler. From there, I can just simply save this guy off. I'm going to put it back into reading view. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to give it the September 2018 as a name. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save. I'm going to open up my workspace here. And I'm going to come down into the data set section. You can see this file name 2018-0901. Just to show you what I can do from a refresh standpoint, I'm going to come down here to the schedule refresh option. And you can see all I have is this OneDrive refresh. It knows how this data came in, and it's turned on or it's turned off. And those are my only options. So that's it. So that let me import data from Excel. Let's try the other option. Let's connect to data in Excel. So I've got another file. I'm going to go down here and hit Files. I'm going to come into OneDrive Demos. And I'm going to come into Deep Dive. And I'm going to come down here to this file called Tweets. So I'm monitoring tweets for a number of hashtags. And this is an Excel file that has got a data model built up that's loading its data from a SQL Azure server. And it's pulling in the SharePoint tweets. Since June, I believe, is when I started doing it. I'm going to connect to that Excel file now here in Power BI. Now, that same file, obviously, is going to be here, this tweets file. I'm going to open it in SharePoint. And you can see we've got 6,606 tweets available right here. And it's going against a data model. I've got a slicer, and this is only showing us since the beginning of September, this particular report. It's filtered. But if I wanted to look at everything from the 7th, I can pick the 7th. And it should, yeah, there we go. It goes and updates the workbook. So it's totally interactive. Okay, but I'm going to go and turn that filter off. And I just want you to remember that number, 6,606. That was saved this morning. If I pop back over here to Power BI, I should be able to come into my report section now, and I should be able to find tweets. Actually, no, it's over here in workbooks. And here's tweets. So I can view that same file in Power BI. This is the Power BI interface. I'm just going to say, yes, I've got it. Same behavior. And if you look at the top here, it says Excel Online with 6,606 tweets. The interesting part for me is I can come over here to demos, go over here to workbooks. And if I just come down here and say, I want to go ahead and refresh now. I want to go ahead and refresh now. There we go. We see the little wheel start to spin. It's going to go off and go to my data source and pull in those tweets. While it's doing that, I just want to show you how you can set up a scheduled refresh on this. And this is more typical for Power BI. I could come into the scheduled refresh section, keep your data up to date, and say, I would like this updated daily at a specific time. I could add in, say, 8, let's make it 7 o'clock a.m. And in this case, it's in Eastern time. If I go ahead and hit apply, now that model is going to get updated at 7 a.m. every single day. And you can see right now, that we have a refresh in progress. And it takes about, the last time I checked, it took about 40 seconds to do a full refresh. So once again,
quick question.
Yes.
So Christine asked over in the chat whether there's a difference in fetching data via the browser versus the desktop app. Is there a difference? Is there a scenario where one's better?
Better is a qualitative statement. No, it's exactly the same. You're running the same Power Query and behind the scene. When you fetch the data, by the word fetch, I mean in the initial import. When I go and get that initial import with the app, all I can do is just run the report off that data that I got. When I bring it into the desktop, I can massage that. I can add calculated columns, calculate measures, etc. So the desktop is going to be the way you want to go and originally get the data. If you mean the refresh, I can refresh the data in the desktop. I can refresh the data through the browser. It's exactly the same mechanism. All it's doing is replaying my Power Query, right? Every single time. If I come in here, it's going to still be in progress, so it's going to make a liar out of me. And I'm not going to waste everybody's time by making them wait, because sometimes it just takes longer than others. Yeah, it's going to take a bit. But the point being, it's going to go ahead and refresh. If I was to come down back out here to come down to tweets, and we would get up in the upper right-hand side the last time that data was refreshed. Yeah, we still haven't finished. But we could come back here into SharePoint, open that same file. No, it's still 6,606. We don't get to see that magic number increment. What happened? But the point here is the Power BI service, by connecting to it, enables the Excel file within SharePoint to get refreshed. All right. And then finally, working with Excel, I'm going to close that guy. I'm going to use Power BI Desktop now. And using Power BI Desktop, I'm going to come over here to Get Data. And I've got a number of those Ecobee files I was telling you about. They all have the same schema. You just saw the month of September. I was able to load that single file. What I'm going to do is use the SharePoint folder connector. I'm not going to use Excel. In fact, I'm pulling from CSV in this case, but it's the same principle. I'm going to type in SharePoint, and I'm going to use the SharePoint folder. I'm going to connect to the SharePoint folder, and I'm going to get the site URL. If I pop down here and grab that, it should be here. Now, the thing to be aware of is the SharePoint folder connector. I should ask Christian, how long do we have? Do we have a hard time limit or no?
Eventually, I want to eat dinner and go to sleep. Other than that.
Oh, you'll be good. Okay. All right. So I'll get through this. It may be a little longer than an hour. That's all. All right. So the point about the SharePoint folder connector that you should be aware of is it has nothing to do with SharePoint folders, which is unfortunate given the name. What it's first of all, it's the big letters on this dialog box say SharePoint folder. So you're inclined to go get the URL for the SharePoint folder. What it's actually asking for in little letters down here is the site URL. And what the SharePoint folder connector does is it goes and gets all of the files in the site collection. So that's what it's after. So what if I click OK here, it's going to go and do a query of my site collection and go get that. Now, I'm going to just quickly pop over here we're back to my SharePoint. And just remember, deep dive. Okay. So that is one of the folders that I'm in. I thought I clicked OK, but nothing's happening. All right. Please enter a value. I did. All right. Okay. My mouse is acting up to me. The demo effect is in great effect today, isn't it? All right.
Murphy laws always apply, John. You know that.
They do. And everything always works slower with an audience, too. You notice that? There we go. All right. So what this is basically giving me is a preview of what I'm going to go get for if I was to just run the query now. If I was to just go ahead and load this in, it would pull in essentially a listing of files for the site collection. I don't want to do that. I need to use Power Query. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Transform Data, and that's going to open up the Power Query window. Bring it over here. And you can see this is that file list. But over here we have the path of the file. And I happen to know that it's got the word deep dive in it. So I'm going to throw in a text filter in this column. And I'm going to, oh, not equals, John, not equals. I want to say that my text filter contains the word deep dive, or words deep dive. Deep dive. All right. So I just click on that, and it's going to filter all of my results by that. So this is everything that has the path deep dive in it. Now you can see I have a lot of files in that particular folder and subfolder, but I want all of these ones. Report, well, they're the only ones that end in CSV. So I'm going to come over to the extension column now. I'm going to deselect all, and I just want the ones that say CSV. All right, those are the files in question. So what this represents is every month that I've been measuring my data with my Ecobee. All right, now this is real data. I use this on a regular basis because I'm a geek, but you knew that. So I'm going to come over here now to this section where it says content. So if you're going to load data from Excel, from SharePoint, and it's a single file, you would go ahead and click on binary. And when you click on binary, it's going to load the Excel file connector, and everything's going to be golden. But Power BI is going to know how to refresh data from SharePoint because you started with the folder. But our situation here is a little more complex. I've got a number of files I want to combine. So I'm going to do that by using the Combine button in the upper right-hand corner of this column. When I do that, it's going to go out and build some functions that let me do that. So we'll just wait a second here. It's going to make a connection to the CSV. And it's going to put together some Power Query functions for me. It shouldn't take too long. Oh, first of all, it comes up with a preview. It shows me the first file. And you can see some problems with this file. It's not perfect. We've got extra rows of data at the top, some header information that we can't deal with at this point. I just have to go ahead and load this in and hope for the best. But we're going to be able to deal with this here in just a second. So we go ahead and evaluate this query, and you can see all of these functions up at the top. But here's the query we're dealing with right now, and this is what we're looking at. This is a combined file. But I need to get rid of this because down here in the data ways, I'm going to see another instance of this. That's going to throw everything off. But if I come up here to the sample file, this is that first sample file that the tool used to read everything else. And I can make modifications to it that will then be applied to all of the other files. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to go to the upper left-hand corner here and just say, I want to remove the top rows. And I need to get rid of the top 5 rows of every file. So as long as it's consistent, we're good. I now want to take that first row and make it my titles. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, use the first row as headers. It's going to go off and do that for me. You'll see here the date will show up as the header of the column here. There we go. Now we have a problem, though. If we come down here to our query, there's an error. And you can see the error is the column 1 of the table wasn't found. Well, we've just promoted that first row as the column name. Now that column 1 doesn't exist. In fact, it's date. The easy way to deal with that is to come over here to the right. This last step, this is a Power Query. This is the number of steps that are applied along the way. I can go back and find out where the error was. If I go back a level, you can see everything was fine prior to this step. So I was able to run my function. But when I went to change the types of the column and I referred to the column names up here, that's when everything broke. I got a couple of choices. I could actually go and modify the code up here, or I could just get rid of the step altogether. And I'm going to do that by clicking on the X. And that's great. I do now, though, need to go and add in my column types. So first thing I need to do, or I'm going to do, is get rid of my first column. I don't need to know the original file name that it came from. I know that this column here is a date type. I know that the next column here is a time type. The next few columns are text, so I'm going to flag them accordingly. And you can see I just clicked on the upper left-hand corner of those columns to do them one at a time. If I want to do mass, I can come up here to transform and say the data type is text. And I'll go ahead and let that finish. And I'll just select these guys now, these other columns. Come to the right. These are all numbers. So I'm just going to select all of these guys, and I'm going to say they're all decimal numbers, even though some of them are integers. All right, and final thing is this blank column at the end, I'm just going to remove that. All right, so I've applied that to my query. We're golden. We're ready to load data in. All right, and now if I come up here to home, I'm going to hit close and apply. Now the Power Query is more complex than we've seen before, and it's loading the data into the data model here in Power BI Desktop. And this will take just a moment, or hopefully not too long. So another great spot to have a question if we happen to have one. 611 rows, 8,000, 17,000. We're getting there. Crickets, eh, Christian?
I don't have the sound effect yet. Apologies, John.
You guys.
No. Post-production, I'll be there.
I thought you were a pro, man. So you can see how many data points we're dealing with, right? We're already at 140,000, 150,000, so 150,000 data points. So about a year's worth of data in 5-minute increments, no surprise. But let's do exactly the same thing we did in the service now here in Power BI Desktop and see what happens. There's a couple of differences. Let's start off by picking cooling stage 1, cooling stage 2, again, heating stage 1, heating stage 2. And we get this initial start. Now, remember those colors? I didn't love the colors, and I could have done this in the service, but I'm going to click here in my visuals property box. I'm just going to expand that. I'm going to come down here to data colors, and instead of having orange for my heat stage 1, I'm going to have it be kind of a pink, and heat stage 2 is going to be a darker red. So I'm going to pick those from the palette. This is using the new palette. All right, so now I've got those guys lit up. I'm going to come up here now to date, and I'm going to drag it. Oh, I got to click over here on my data element. I'm going to take date, and I'm going to drag that over to my axis. So something you'll notice right away that did not happen in the service that does happen here in Power BI Desktop is it's broken out into year. Well, I can drill down on the year into the quarter, the month, the day, etc. And I'm doing full drills down, right? And the reason this happens is because automatically Power BI Desktop is creating a time hierarchy for me. It's a simple one, it's a default one, and you may even want to turn it off and create your own. But this is here available for you. I don't want to use quarter. But other than that, I'm kind of happy with that. And I might want to drill this down now into months. So now you can see the year with the month. And then let's, oh, that's good enough. But the other thing I don't like having is the terms concatenated together. So I'm just going to come over here to my x-axis, and I'm going to tell it not to concatenate my labels. And so now you can see 2018 is a different line than the various month numbers. So that's pretty good representation of what I'd like to see. And again, I'm going to change it into my stacked column chart. I'm going to just bring this down here into my stacked column chart. Now I could just add my temperature and do exactly what I did before, but now I have access to a full model editor. So I could come down here to outdoor temperature and come up here to modeling. And I can change the property of that field now. And I can, instead of having it, the default aggregation be sum, I can come down here and tell it to be average. And now when I add this guy in over here, now when I add outdoor temperature into the line values, I'm not going to have to go and change it there. And the beauty of that, of course, is if you're going to use that measure in other visuals, you're not going to have to repeat that process over and over again. So what you can see now is we've got data for an entire year. And you can see, by the way, this summer has been a lot cooler than last summer, and I've noticed that myself. So I don't know if your experience in Utah is the same, but it's a question that came up here. I've got the data to show that, so I'm able to show that. So but all of that stuff is basically using Power BI to connect to SharePoint in various ways, or using SharePoint as a container. Now we're ready to talk about using SharePoint as a data source. So just before I'll have one more chance for questions there, and then we'll just dive into SharePoint as a data source. Crickets. He still doesn't have the sound effect, man. That'd be awesome. Ah, yes! Outstanding. All right. Okay. Good. Don't be afraid, folks. All right. So let's start talking about SharePoint as a data source. So up until now, we've looked at it as a container, but we've got list data in SharePoint. We've had ways of going and reporting on list data before, most notably SSRS. The way that works is not the best, because you're pulling data. Every time you run a report, you're doing a query on a SharePoint list, and SharePoint lists aren't really designed for that. With Power BI and Power Query, it's kind of the right way to report on SharePoint data. The first thing to note about using Power Query with SharePoint data is you could be in Power BI or you could be in Excel. It doesn't matter. It's the same technology, and all of this applies to Excel just as well as it applies to Power BI. With both of these, with Power Query, you've got 4 different options to connect to SharePoint data. You've got OData right off the bat, and you may want to use OData if you're connecting to older versions of SharePoint, 2010 and above, that don't support the native SharePoint connectors. The native SharePoint connectors for Power Query are SharePoint List, SharePoint Online List, and SharePoint Folder. You've seen SharePoint Folder already. SharePoint List and SharePoint Online List are really just two versions of the same thing. You use one for on-prem, you use one for online. I'll let you figure out which one's which. But the most important thing about using Power Query with SharePoint data is, as we've seen, that data is cached. It's pulled into the data model. So when you're running your reports, the reports are running against the data in the data model, and that data model is periodically refreshed. So you're not constantly hammering on your SharePoint lists. It's a lot more manageable. It's a lot more performant. It's a lot more secure. It is basically introducing the concept of a data mart or a data warehouse, as opposed to connecting to data in situ. Power Query is supported both by Analysis Services and Azure Analysis Services, so it's got a great grow-up story if you wanted to take your data model from Excel or Power BI and move it into those environments. Bob's your uncle. You can go ahead and do that. Power Query also lets you mash up your data with other data sources. So you may have one of your tables is coming in from a SharePoint list, another table might be coming from SQL, and you can now perform joins and reporting operations on those two different types of data. So it really doesn't matter where the data comes from once it's into the data model. The other massive feature, in my opinion, are the helpers that are available. We're going to talk about these options here in just a second. And then finally, this works on-prem just as well as it does in the cloud through the on-premises data gateway. So you could be using Power BI, the Power BI service against SharePoint Online. It works against SharePoint on-prem. And in fact, you can be using Power BI Report Server on-prem to use Power BI reports running against SharePoint on-prem or SharePoint Online. You can mix and match however you like. We already talked a little bit about the various data connectors. With OData, again, you can express every SharePoint list as an OData source by adding that. The site URL with the listdata.svc. There's another one you can use as well. API, _API is the other extension. But this one works just as well as anything. But the problem with SharePoint, and if anybody's ever if you've ever done any development work with SharePoint, you've got these complex column types. So the text field's easy enough to work with, the number fields are easy enough to work with. But you got these complex column types. And when you drill in through the SharePoint API, typically, you'll find the data in there isn't exactly what you might be expecting. So with a text field, if the value of white is there, you'll see white in the API. But if it's a person, for example, you might not see John White. You would see a number with a hashtag and a semicolon. You might see John White in there as well, but more often than not, you're going to see some odd combination of characters, maybe a reference to another list, etc., depending on what the column type is. And so this is a list of all of the column types, or all of the what I would consider to be complex column types in SharePoint. Some of these are all variations of a lookup column. So with the lookup column, you're actually storing the identity of the source item that you looked up instead of the value, when you would expect to maybe see the text from the value like you would in a SharePoint view. You get things like the rich text field, which stores data in HTML format. Well, when you're reporting on that data, Power BI doesn't render HTML. So that becomes a bit of a mess. You see a whole lot of div, et cetera, et cetera. So you need some way of dealing with that. And you can do a lot of this stuff. You can work around a lot of this stuff, do a lookup from the source list if you've got that unique identifier, et cetera. And that's what we had to do for a while with Power BI. But now we have these helpers. These various helper techniques for working with SharePoint data. And the most important one, if you get one thing out of sitting and listening to me talk for an hour and change, it's the field values as text column. If you connect to a SharePoint list with Power BI Desktop, you'll see a column called field values as text. And what it does is it renders that complex column type as if you would see it in a list. So it's going to accommodate about 90% of your use cases. It's going to handle that for you. So it'll take a rich text column and it'll just turn it into simple text. Beautiful stuff. It'll take a person field and render that person's name. You also get these things called column extensions. So at the end of your query, you'll see a column with, say, author. And what that is you'll see that it's got a cell value of record. And if you expand that, you'll see all the various fields for a person. And what it's done is it's gone and looked up that source item and it's stuck it in there as a record just as an entity, and you can expand that out. So if you wanted to, for example, get the email address of the person in the person field, you could use the extension column to go and do that for you. And the other neat thing about Power BI is it lets you build these relational tables. So if you're looking at something like a multi-value column in SharePoint, and that's what we're going to drill in on here in just a minute, a multi-value column is really just a way of trying to take a flat data system like SharePoint or like Excel and make it act in a relational way. It's a way to express a one-to-many relationship. There are many values for this particular attribute that suits this one record. Well, Power BI gives us a mechanism to deal with that. And we'll see what that looks like here in just a second. We're going to drill in on that one, but if you want information on any of these others, I've got a series of blog posts on this. And for anybody who might have joined later, just to reiterate the point, the URL at the bottom will give you access to this deck, or you can just take a shot of that QR code on the right-hand side, and that's going to give you access to this deck. But there's a blog post that's dedicated to each one of these field types. And as well, there's a Microsoft white paper. You'll see that at the end of the presentation. One of the three I bring up at the end that's dedicated to exactly this, working with these complex field types. So let's have a demo. Time for another demo. All right. I'm going to pop back over here into my SharePoint site, and I'm going to come over here to properties. Here, I've got that already loaded. So this is a bit of a contrived example. It's a list that has basically one of every field type that's available to SharePoint, and it's filled out. And I used real estate as an example. So it's basically houses for sale. So you've got the picture of the house, you've got a location field, that's the new one that was added last year, a title that everybody would expect to see, a URL type or HTML type field. We've got a rich text field right here with some HTML in it, a person field, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see here there's an amenities field, and that's an example of a multi-value column. Thank you. So we want to be able to report off of that data. We want to basically build up a report that will show us all of the properties that are available that have a specific type of amenity. So Power BI desktop to the rescue again. I'm just going to come up here and create a new report. That's just going to take a second to load. It's the biggest gap of any of the presentation is loading Power BI desktop. All right, it's just popped up in another window, so I'm going to drag it over here. Crickets again. Okay, very good. I don't even have to ask.
When I got this too.
All right. What's that?
There we go.
You need a gong for if I go on too long about something.
Okay, I'll go look at that as well. Hang on.
So I'm going to type in SharePoint again. And now I'm going to pick SharePoint Online List because that's what this is. I'm going to go ahead and connect. And again, SharePoint Lists is not the URL of the list. It's the URL of the site. So I'm going to click OK. And it's going to interrogate that. And we'll come back with a rather extensive list of lists in that SharePoint site. And it's a very extensive list. It's all the lists that you didn't know you had already, right? You got the user information list down here. That's that hidden person field that has basically is the source for any person lookup. It's got the taxonomy hidden list, which is your managed metadata list that is really just a lookup field. But we're interested in properties. So I'm going to come over here and click on properties. And we'll get that eval preview here in just a second. All right, and it's got the data we're after in it. If we scroll to the right, we'll see neighborhood, we'll see some descriptions, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to go ahead and transform data. Now, working with SharePoint lists, it's going to return a lot of data that we don't want and we don't need, and we should get rid of because we don't want to bloat up our data model. So that's one of the first things to note right out of the gate. So I'm going to get rid of file system object type. I'm going to spend a couple seconds here getting rid of data. I'm going to set the data type of this guy right now to a whole number. And I'm going to get rid of these guys. Picture, I could deal with it, but I don't need to deal with it right now, so I'm just going to lose that. There's location. See what the location field is? It's a bunch of JavaScript that's jammed into a field. I'm just going to get rid of it too. But it's also represented elsewhere, and we'll come to that here in just a second. So I'm not worried about that. Here's neighborhood. Well, all I get is the ID of the neighborhood. So I'm going to get rid of that. It's not much use to me as it sits. There's that description field, the rich text field. See, it starts with div, class, external, etc. Unless I want to start doing a whole bunch of search and replace, I'm going to get rid of that. Agent ID, agent string ID, person field is just a number. More info and continent, we don't need those, so I'm getting rid of those. All right, I'm going to leave the amenities list. I'm going to come over here to content type ID. Now we're getting into some interesting stuff. I'm going to get rid of content type ID, compliance asset ID. And now you see this country or region, state, postal code, street, geoloc. I'm not going to work with latitude and longitude, so I'm going to get rid of that. But these are all of the address fields that come from using a location field. So when you get this location field, you've got a rich set of tools to report on it. Everything else to the right, I pretty much don't need. So I'm going to go from here, and I'm going to scroll all the way over here and highlight this. Now, before I delete them, I wanted to point out agent, neighborhood, editor, author. These are those extension columns that I was talking about before. So I could drill into those and get out additional properties of, say, the neighborhood, which happens to be a managed metadata field, or the author, or the agents. I could get the agent's email, etc. All I want is their name, so I don't need any of that stuff. Now, again, before I remove it, I'm going to come over here to this very important column called, if I can find it, where are we here? Field values as text. I'm just going to deselect this guy. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and remove these guys. And I'm going to expand field values as text. All right. And you can see these are all the same column names that we've just been working with. But they have this nice attribute that if I select them, and I'm going to turn off select all columns, I'm not going to use the original column name as prefix, because otherwise everything would start with field values as text dot description or neighborhood or agent. All right, I'm just going to pick those guys, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see what's happened here. It's pulled in the neighborhood, it's pulled in that description in a non-rich text fashion, it's pulled in the name of the agent instead of just the number. So that's been a very useful tool to me. Now I'm coming over here to amenities. I'm going to get to the meat of this. I'm going to expand out amenities, and this is a list, not a record. So it's got multiple values. So how do I want to handle that? I got two options. I can extract values or expand to new rows. I'm going to go ahead and extract values to start with, and I'm going to give it a delimiter. So comma is my delimiter. I'm going to click OK. And you can see what it's done. And that's exactly how it shows in a SharePoint list. And by the way, I could have used field values as text to do exactly the same thing, but I wanted to show you that this is available here as well. So I'm going to just take this and I'm going to load this into a data model. That should just take a second. It'd take a lot longer if I hadn't gone and deleted a lot of those columns, by the way. Come on. All right, here we go. All right, so now you can see the columns that we have over here on the right. First thing we need to do, I want to know the number of properties. So I'm going to create this calculate a measure. And that, again, was something you couldn't do directly in the service. So I'm going to create a new measure. And I come to the formula at the top. And this is writing in DAX now. Oh, I clicked on something that I should not have clicked on. New measure. All right. This is DAX. So I'm just going to create a new measure. It's going to be called properties. And that is equal to the count of the rows. I'm just going to count the number of rows in my table. So that's called properties. And I'm going to autocomplete. It's a lot like working with the Excel formula language, DAX is, and that's exactly who it's aimed at. So you shouldn't be afraid of it. So I'm just going to click on properties to give me a number. And because it's a number, it gives me a column chart. I don't want that to be a column chart. I'd like that to be a card. And so there we have 5 properties. That's what we're working with here. So I'm just going to pin that up here in the upper right-hand corner. And now I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to lay out a table. And I'm going to throw off show up the street address. Maybe I'm going to throw in the city. Oh, it picked a map because it knew that was a geographic column. But I'm going to turn that into a table. So there you go. You can see street, city. I'm going to give it that description field. Maybe the asking price. The description field's too big. I'm just going to take that off. I'm going to give it a display name. And then maybe the agent. All right. And finally, the full amenities list for this item. So I'm going to pick amenities here. All right. So if you remember, our goal is to be able to get a list of properties by amenity. So I'm going to come up here and just pick amenities. And I'm going to select slicer, which is how you slice and dice data. And I can see a problem right off the bat. I'd like to be able to pick all the properties that had appliances, but I can't just select that, right? Because I've got this joined value. So I can pick all the ones that have these various combinations, but that's not all that useful to me. So let's try this a different way. Let's go into edit my queries. I'm going to come back here. And now I'm going to come to Power Query and I'm going to turn off extracted values. And I'm going to come up here to amenities, hit it again. And I'm going to, in this case, expand to new rows. And what we get is a row for each unique value of the amenities with all of the other values copied. Now, Power BI handles that fairly well because it aggregates data. So once we load this data in, we should see dramatic pause. The internet likes to mess with my timing, I swear. Thanks, man. I needed that. I have no idea why it takes so long to load. Normally, this is just a few seconds, but of course, you've heard that before. Oh, come on. Well, I'm glad we have more than an hour because we're already over that.
Yeah, I think in the post, I'll go in and edit like all these pauses so the data is instantly there. Of course, then your webinar will be like 25 minutes long.
Yeah. Well, that's okay though. That's better. I did this as a lightning talk 2 weeks ago.
That was a hurricane weather lightning. Yeah,
it worked. So all right. So we've loaded in. We see appliances. We got 5 properties with appliances, 4 with a basement, 2 with a driveway, etc. So this is working exactly the way we want it to, right? Right? Let's remove any filters. Now we have a problem. We don't have 20 properties. So this isn't right either. Let's go do something better. Let's go back here and edit the queries. And I'm going to de-expand my amenities again. And I'm going to come back here to where it's just a list. Now I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to right-click on properties, and I'm going to duplicate my query. All right? So basically, I'm just creating another table with the same query. And it's going to get a different name. I'm going to call this guy amenities. All right. And I'm going to go to ID, and I'm going to come over here to amenities and say, these are the only 2 fields I need. So I'm going to remove all of the other columns. Great. And now I'm going to expand my amenities column out to new rows. So you can see what we have here. We've got repeated IDs, and we've got amenities here. Okay, that's great. Now I'm going to come up here to properties. I'm going to expand out amenities and do what I did before, right? I'm going to extract the values, and I'm going to use a comma, and I'm going to click OK. And the only reason I might want to do this is for display purposes, okay? So now I've got this properties column, or properties table, and an amenities column, a separate amenities column, and they both have IDs. So if I close and apply this guy, let it load. It's a little faster this time, so that's good. Yay, okay. And I'm going to come down here to the relationship builder, and you can see it's figured out that there's a relationship between these 2 tables already and that it's a one-to-many relationship. The ID is the common value. I'm going to make this a bidirectional cross filter, so I can filter one table by the other. And I'm going to come back up here. And now in my slicer, you can see we're back to concatenated values. Well, that's because we're using amenities from the properties table. I'm going to change that to use amenities from the amenities table. And now we see we've got 5 properties with nothing selected. We select appliances, we get 5, basement 4, etc. Now it's behaving the way we want it to. We've just taken SharePoint data and made it relational, the way it should be from a reporting standpoint. So we've made it a lot more efficient. So that hopefully is a valuable tip or a trick. Now, I'm going to pop back over here to the slides for a bit. Maybe I'm not going to quite pop. Come on, pop. All right. Yeah. presentation had stopped. There we go. All right. So moving forward a little bit, I'm going to zip through the SharePoint as a report canvas. This is just kind of arbitrary stuff talking about various different types of reports, talking about Power BI Report Server. I mentioned Power BI Report Server before. We no longer have integrated mode reporting services in SharePoint, haven't for a while. We have native mode SSRS, but we also have Power BI Report Server. Power BI Report Server is SSRS running in native mode, but also with the ability to run full-on Power BI reports. So if you're on-prem with SharePoint and you want to connect to on-prem reports, you're going to probably be using Power BI Report Server to do it. Both Power BI Report Server and Power BI the service can render all of the same type of reports. And the news here is actually the Power BI service can render paginated reports, which paginated reports are what we call the old style SSRS RDL reports. How do we embed this stuff in SharePoint, which is really what we're concerned with? If we're dealing with Power BI reports and we're in SharePoint Online, we use the Power BI web part. You've got to be using modern SharePoint pages to work with it. So we have to be online and we have to be using modern pages. Classic pages do not work. It's a client-side tool and it basically embeds the Power BI report in SharePoint in full fidelity. What happens if you're using classic mode SharePoint, if you're on-prem? Up until the spring, the answer is you're kind of out of luck. But it's no longer true. We can now use this secure embed feature in Power BI, and we can get now a URL that we can embed in just about any website, including any SharePoint site using classic pages through the script editor web part, or you can use SharePoint Online. Or SharePoint on-prem is what I think I should have been saying there. So when you're working with SharePoint as a dashboarding platform, you can embed. Well, these are your options now for using SharePoint as a dashboard. You can use Excel services, the web part, the way you always have been able to since SharePoint 2007. That still works. It even works in modern. So you can take pieces of Excel files and embed them on SharePoint pages. You can use the SSRS report viewer web part. That's for embedding on-premises paginated reports, RDL files. You can do that on premises. It works a lot better than the old native mode web part did. It's got all the features that the integrated mode web part did. You are going to have to be using Kerberos if you want to use that, though. You can use the Power BI web port if your SharePoint site happens to be in modern and you're using SharePoint the service. You can't use the Power BI web part to embed a Power BI report server report, which is again on-prem, in the service, but I don't know why you would. You can use the secure embed feature pretty much anywhere. You can use a script editor web part or a page viewer web part. If you're on premises again, using either Power BI Report Server or SQL Server reporting services, you could append RS embed equals true to the end of any one of your types of reports, and that makes them embeddable. It removes all the Chrome from your report. So those are your options for embedding in SharePoint page. Of course, any other content type you want to use with a web part, you could put on a SharePoint dashboard. This is a bit of an eye chart. It's a lot of an eye chart, actually. But depending on what you want to embed and where you want to embed it, this table shows you the way you can do that. All right. So, for example, if I want to take a Power BI visual from the Power BI service and embedded it in the service, you just basically pick PBIX and Power BI service, and you would come over here to SharePoint Online Modern, and it tells you you can use the Power BI web part, or you can use Secure Embed if you wanted to do that. But if you wanted to use a classic page, you'd need to use the Secure Embed with the script editor web part, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll leave that for later on. The on-premises stuff is a little bit important, especially with SharePoint 2019. I don't know how many people here are listening or with SharePoint 2019 or looking at it, but if you've got investments in BI in prior versions of SharePoint, you're going to want to look carefully at this table because just about everything is gone. There are no BI features any longer in SharePoint, with one exception, and that's been given its death sentence, Performance Point. It's actually still there, but they've pulled out one of the only reasons that anybody would have used Performance Point in the first place, which is decomposition trees. So you're going to need to move to one destination or another, move those BI assets before you move your SharePoint, move to SharePoint 2019. For the most part, I'd actually argue now, in every case, there is a migration path. There's a destination for you. How easy that is a slightly different question. So, final demo, quick demo, hopefully, using the SharePoint web part. Good chance for any questions, though, if we got any. No.
Yeah, the one question
Okay.
Naveed just asked: Power BI web part not available in SharePoint 2019 on-prem?
Correct. It is not. Power BI web part is not in, even though we've got SharePoint Framework in SharePoint 2019 on-prem, there is no Power BI web part. So I'm going to go ahead and that report that really pretty report that we just built, I'm going to go ahead and just quickly save this off. Temp. I'm going to call this report temp. Wonderful, huh? I'm so imaginative. So I'm going to call it temp, and I'm going to publish it out to, oh, shoot. I'm going to have to log into a different tenant. I just realized that. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my account. Sorry about that. And of course.
It's my opportunity here. I'm missing. So.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Oh, there you go. There you go. Now, of course, I have to hit my two-factor. Here we go. Oh, good.
Oh, wait. This, I've got another sound for this one.
Doing. All right.
Audience laughing.
Instead of publishing this, you got to keep those handy, man. Instead of doing that, I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to pick a report that we already have. I'm not sure which one I'm going to use, so just bear with me. What's going to be the best one to use? Jason's house weather. How's that? That makes sense? Here's a whole bunch of, yeah, why not? We're going to use Jason's house weather. No, September 2018. That's the this guy. All right, this is the report we built before. So I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to come up to my ellipses and I'm going to go embed into SharePoint Online. My organization has deleted the device. Wonderful. I'm going to have to fix that. I'm going to copy this URL. And I'm going to come back now to my SharePoint. So if I come back to here and I come home, I'm going to come up here and just make a new page. So a new SharePoint page. I'm going to use a blank page and create down at the bottom right. I'm going to call it User Group Demo. All right. And I'm just going to come and do a web part insert, modern web part insert, type in power because I don't want to scroll through looking for it. And I'm going to grab the Power BI web part. I'm going to add a report. I'm just going to paste that link here. Give it just a second, hopefully. And I'm going to specify the page I want it to display. And I'm going to turn off navigation page because this is only a one-page report. And I'm going to go ahead and hit publish. And it's publishing. Ta-da! All right, and I'll just close this. And once that's done, you can see I've got this. Well, there's not a lot of interactivity I can show you with this particular report, but I could be clicking on the data bar. I'll do it just so you can see the everything goes grayed out besides the one I have selected. But it's fully interactive right within the context of a SharePoint page. So that's the Power BI web part. What if I've got classic pages? Well, I'm going to come over here. And I should have a notepad. And well, no, I don't, but I'm going to just grab some code here. All right, so I'm going to come over here to a classic site. This is classic SharePoint on premises. So SharePoint 2016 to be sure, not 2019, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. And I'm going to create a new page, add a new classic page. And I'm going to call it Power BI Report. Go ahead and click create. Oh, again, what a surprise. New. All right, so this shouldn't take long. Famous last words. I'm going to come over here and insert some embed code. And I'm going to just grab some code here. I thought I had it ready, but I don't have it. Didn't have it handy. So just 1 second. Copy, because nobody wants to see me typing. And I'm going to paste this guy in. So this is an iframe. Basically, I'm going to be embedding an iframe. This is an iframe with nothing. I'm just going to come back over here to Power BI. Same thing I did before with embed, only this time not picking SharePoint. I picked website or portal. And that gives me the secure embed code that I can then come over here and paste into my SRC tag. Control V, insert that, and away we go, or we should go. If the demo gods are with me, and they're not, of course, as usual. I'm not sure what's happening. Edit this one more time before I get, oh, there it is. There it's rendering. Okay, I'm just impatient. I think I have some internet stress going on. So once I save this guy off, there you go. That's rendering right within the context of a SharePoint Classic mode page. It's not single sign-on, so I have to basically have my Power BI token for this to work. Otherwise, I'm going to see an error in that screen. But if we are signed into both environments, it will work. All right. Finally, back to the deck and wrap this guy up. We're not too bad over time. I referenced a series of white papers that basically cover all of this stuff off. 3 different white papers were released a couple of months ago, written by myself and Jason Himmelstein by Microsoft. You'll find them in the tech community, the Microsoft tech community. So using SharePoint as a data source for modern reporting, generally the complex SharePoint field types, and then the modern dashboarding platform. So that kind of covers it off. And just to summarize, you can see here that SharePoint with Power BI, it depends on what you're talking about. As to what approach you want to use. It has multiple roles. Using it as a data source requires a little bit of care and feeding, but luckily it's gotten a whole lot easier lately. And it still remains a really good platform to deliver content, BI content to your end users. And with that, one more appeal to listen to the podcast, and we'll move into the cricket section.
You don't have any other questions posted, so if anybody has a final question for John.
Hit me.
Obviously, you've got his email right there if you want to follow it with him directly and ask any questions. For those that are watching this recording on YouTube, which will be up later today, feel free to reach out to John. But you know, if there's no questions posted, John, really appreciate your taking the time today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love this one. It's kind of I get to marry both of my disciplines, so there they are.
Excellent. Well, with that, no other questions posted, and we'll go ahead and let you go. And thanks a lot for your time. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye.